Hello and welcome, friends. It's your most slimmest host, Salt and Skinny, emir of all that's lean and politically unclean. The Abbasid Caliphate was the most advanced and powerful empire of its day. Its capital, Baghdad, was the largest city in the world, where people from all over the empire and beyond came to study and trade. The Caliphs themselves were so internationally renowned that they eventually just started being known through their titles as opposed to their actual names, like As-Safa and Al-Mansur. The era of the Abbasid Caliphate, from the founding of the House of Wisdom to its burning in 1258 CE, is considered by many historians to be the golden age of Islamic civilization. But as prosperous as this dynasty was in terms of its literature, science, and wealth, the Abbasid Caliphate was not the most stable political entity. In fact, the entirety of the Islamic Golden Age was a period of Islamic disunity, with dozens of new dynasties, emirates, and rival caliphs rising and falling across the medieval world. In this episode, we will be looking at not one, not two, but three separate caliphates that competed with one another for legitimacy and influence in the Islamic world. This is the tale of the three caliphs. Harun al-Rashid is by far the most famous of the Abbasid Caliphs. It is under his rule that the Bayt al-Hikmah would be built and that the Islamic Golden Age is said to have commenced. But al-Rashid's rule would also prove to be the beginning of the end for the Abbasid dynasty. It starts with al-Rashid naming his son Muhammad al-Amin to be his successor. Al-Amin's older brother, Abdullah al-Mamun, would be the second in line for succession. Despite being the oldest of al-Rashid's sons, al-Mamun's mother was a Persian concubine, while al-Amin's was a descendant of al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph. Because of this more pure Arab lineage, al-Amin got first dibs of being Caliph, something that al-Mamun would forever be jealous of. After the death of their father, al-Amin would rule as Caliph in Baghdad, and al-Mamun would rule as the governor of the province of Khorasan. Khorasan held much prestige in the Abbasid Empire, being the land from where the revolution started. Because of this, the province enjoyed a status of relative autonomy in the empire. However, Al-Amin wanted to take away this status. On top of that, Al-Amin also had a son, and demanded that Al-Amun recognize the child as the next in line for Caliph. With the support of the people of Khorasan and other Iranians, Al-Mamun challenged the rule of his brother, beginning what is known as the Fourth Fitna, or the Great Abbasid Civil War. In 813 CE, Al-Mamun's forces, led by a Khorasan general known as Tahir ibn Hussein, captured the city of Baghdad. Al-Amin would be executed by Tahir's forces, and Al-Mamun would be crowned as Caliph. Al-Mamun's reign was one of quashing rebellions and great scientific innovation. He encouraged the translation of Old Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Saranic texts into Arabic, beginning what is known as the translation movement. Al-Mamun would also challenge his scholars to do things like map the known world and create chemical compounds that can turn lead into gold. The latter was never realized. In gratitude for his military service, Al-Mamun appointed General Tahir ibn Hussein to be the governor of Khorasan. Despite recognizing the Abbasid Caliph as the central authority, the province of Khorasan enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, to the point that they created their own Tahirid imperial dynasty that ruled over much of the Iranian plateau and even the capital of Baghdad. While still technically part of the Abbasid Empire, the Tahirids promoted the use of the Pahlavi script and Persian language throughout their domain, being in a way the first independent Iranian dynasty since the Sassanids. The Tahirids of Khorasan were not the only autonomous dynasty in the Abbasid Empire. In the province of Africa, in modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and Sicily, the independent emirate dynasty, known as the Aghlabids, ruled for over 100 years, all while recognizing the supreme leadership of the Abbasid Caliphate. Autonomous emirates such as the Aghlabids and Tahirids were created in order to prevent secession from the Caliphate, but they would prove to only decentralize the empire and eventually divide it. Al-Mamun would be succeeded by his younger half-brother, Abu Ishaq al-Mutazim, in 833 CE. Al-Mutazim had already made a name for himself in the empire, as he commanded an elite army of Turkish mercenaries known as Ghilman, or Mamluks. These Mamluks were crucial to Al-Mamun's victory in the Fourth Fitna, so it only made sense for Al-Mutazim to expand this regiment. As a result, these Turkish warriors were quickly becoming prominent members of the Caliphate's military and politics. This upset a lot of residents in Baghdad, as their prestige was starting to be overshadowed by these foreign fighters who hardly even spoke Arabic. To prevent conflict within Baghdad, Al-Mutazim ordered the construction of a new city where his mercenary army would reside. The city of Samarra would be constructed as the new imperial capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, being under the protection of Al-Mutazim's Mamluk army. After his death, Al-Mutazim would be succeeded by his son Al-Wathiq, who would continue to administer the empire from Samarra. Al-Wathiq would be succeeded by his younger brother Al-Mutawakkil, who would initiate the construction of the Great Samarra Mosque and other grand infrastructure projects in the city. The role of the Mamluks would only grow, as Al-Mutawakkil constantly used them to suppress rebellions and invade foreign lands. Some of these Mamluks even got into high political offices in the Caliphate, being major players in the decision-making process of the empire's affairs. The reliance of these mercenary forces and their expanding powers would prove to be the downfall of Al-Mutawakkil and eventually the entire Abbasid Caliphate. Al-Mutawakkil had two sons that were to succeed him. The eldest, Al-Muntazir, was supported by much of the Mamluk army and politicians. The youngest one, Al-Mutaz, was supported by the mainstream politicians of Baghdad and was generally the more favored by his father. This brotherly jealousy, along with unpopular policies from Al-Mutawakkil, would see Al-Muntazir and his Mamluk supporters plot against the Caliph. In 861 CE, Mamluk troops assassinated Al-Mutawakkil, resulting in Al-Muntazir taking the throne shortly after. However, Al-Muntazir would not rule for long, as he mysteriously died with less than a year of his rule. What occurred after this is often called the Anarchy of Samarra, in which Abbasid brothers and cousins would kill each other off just so they could become caliph. What this anarchy resulted in was the complete destabilization of the Abbasid Caliphate, with provinces like Egypt completely seceding from the empire, and full-out insurrections from both civilian and slave populations, such as the Zanji rebellion. Because of all this chaos and expenses of maintaining Samarra, the Abbasids abandoned the city and reinstated Baghdad as the capital in 892 CE. Over time, the Abbasids would stamp out these rebellions and retake their lost territory. But the caliphate was never the same again. After the anarchy, the title of caliph was symbolic. In theory, they were the head of the Islamic Empire, but in reality, it was the Mamluks who were calling the shots. They chose which caliphs got to rule and which had to die, as they held the bulk of the empire's political office and were themselves the elite military forces of the empire. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the now decentralized Abbasid Empire saw the rise and falls of many dynastic emirates within its domain, such as the Hamidids of Syria, the Samanids of Iran, and the Tulunids of Egypt. Being empires in their own right, these different dynasties would compete and war with one another, all in an effort to become the rulers of the caliphate. In the 930s and 940 CE, a group of Iranian warlords, led by a trio of brothers, conquered much of the Iranian plateau, along with the city of Baghdad. The Abbasids would remain to be caliphs, but they were now under the political control of the Iranian Buyids. Although accepting the Sunni Abbasids as the legitimate caliphs, the Buyids were mostly adherents to Shia Islam, and more often than not called their rulers the Shah, like the Sasanians they claimed descent from. This revitalized Persian dynasty would rule as the guardians of the Abbasid Caliphate for over a century, until being conquered from a new emerging power from the Asian steppes. Under the leadership of Tughril Bey, the nomadic Seljuk Turks united to form a tribe confederacy, conquering much of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. In 1055 CE, Tughril would take the city of Baghdad from the Buyids, liberating the Sunni Caliphs from their Shia Shahs. Tughril would be crowned as Sultan of the Seljuk Empire. As Sultan, Tughril had the supreme rule over his massive empire, but also had the responsibility of preserving and protecting the symbolic power of the Caliphs. The Seljuks themselves were practitioners of Sunni Islam and saw themselves as the guardians of Sunni orthodoxy, warring against any Shia state who challenged their authority. By 1092 CE, the Seljuks were at their greatest extent, ruling the Asian steppes, the Iranian plateau, and most of the Middle East. The Seljuks would also push the Byzantine Empire out of its holdings in Anatolia, turning the peninsula from a predominantly Christian and Greek land into a Muslim and Turkish one. As well as empowering the Abbasid Caliphate, the Seljuks also placed Turkish people in high positions of power across their vast empire. This Turkification of the Islamic world may have begun with the Abbasids and their Mamluk armies, but the Seljuks represented the full realization of this new era of Islamic and Middle Eastern history. Abbasid prestige and Seljuk dominance, however, was constantly being challenged, not by the Christian Byzantines who easily succumbed to their armies, but by another great Islamic empire, one that would dare undermine the Abbasids and declare their dynasty as the legitimate Caliphs. The split between the Shia and Sunni sects of Islam was entirely political, not spiritual. Since the Umayyad dynasty's victory in Karbala, the Sunnis would be the dominant religious and political force of the Islamic world. Although Shias aided the Abbasids in their revolution, the Abbasids were Sunni themselves and ended up persecuting the Shias throughout their empire. The Shias, believing that both the Umayyads and Abbasids were illegitimate caliphs, stirred up rebellions and insurgencies across the empire, especially during the anarchy of Samarra. But despite this shared persecution and grievance, the Shias ended up being their own worst enemy, as disagreements over who the next imam should be split their movement into dozens of smaller sects, each believing that their imam is the legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. One of these sects, the Ismailis, established a secret network of missionaries headquartered in the Syrian city of Salamiya. These secret missionaries would perform dawah, spreading the influence of the Ismaili sect across the Islamic world. In the beginning of the 10th century, the 11th Ismaili Imam, Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah, left Salamiya for North Africa, hoping to find a safe haven during an Abbasid crackdown on Shias. Al-Mahdi would perform dawah throughout his trip in the Maghreb, telling his followers that he was the descendant of Muhammad's daughter Fatima. This proselytizing got al-Mahdi in trouble with the Aghlabid rulers of Ifriqa, who threw him in a dungeon in the city of Sijil Misa, in what is now Morocco. Supporters of al-Mahdi, along with allied Berber tribes, freed him from imprisonment, and together overthrew the Aghlabids in 909 CE. Al-Mahdi would crown himself as the Islamic world's legitimate caliph, for he was the descendant of the Prophet's daughter Fatima, hence the name of his new dynasty, the Fatimids. Al-Mahdi's reign was eventful, as he spent his first few years consolidating power and stamping out rebellions. He founded his capital on the coastal city of Mahdiya, which he named after himself, of course. Al-Mahdi's territory consisted of Mediterranean coastline as well as the island of Sicily, so the Caliph commissioned the construction of a large navy in order to protect his holdings from other seafaring empires, most notably the Byzantines. Al-Mahdi's navy impressed the Bulgarian Emperor Simon I, who proposed that the two should team up against the Byzantines. The envoy that conducted these negotiations was captured by the Byzantine fleet, who learned of the plot that the two powers had against their empire. They arrested the Bulgarians, but allowed the Arabs to go back home with a large sum of gifts for Al-Mahdi, persuading the Caliph not to support the Bulgarians in their war, and instead establish an embassy with the Byzantines. After his death, Al-Mahdi was succeeded by his son Muhammad al-Qaim. During his reign, al-Qaim demonstrated the full power of the Fatimid navy, raiding much of Byzantine Italy, Sardinia, Corsica, and even sacking the city of Genoa. But while al-Qaim was strengthening his position on the seas, his holdings of the desert were becoming contentious. Berber tribes were revolting against the Caliphate, and al-Qaim's successor, Abu Tahir al-Mansur, would be the one to stamp them out. After successfully stabilizing their empire, al-Mansur's son and successor, Abu Tamim al-Muiz, could now turn the attention of their army to face off their greatest foe, the Abbasids. Due to its own political instability, the Abbasids were unable to properly defend their territory, and in 969 CE, the entirety of Egypt fell into Fatimid control. In honor of his victory over the Abbasids, al-Muiz established a new capital city for his empire, Al-Qaira, better known as Cairo. The Fatimids would shortly after take much of the Levant as well as the Hijaz, controlling the holiest cities of Islam. With these possessions, Cairo was quickly becoming the new center of Islamic power, wealth, and learning. The successor of al-Muiz, Nizar al-Aziz, would only further consolidate Fatimid prestige. His rule was marked with economic prosperity, with Egypt producing great amounts of cash crops and controlling trade routes that went as far east as China. Like the Abbasids, al-Aziz started to use Turkish mercenaries as part of the armed forces, mainly operating in the eastern half of the empire, known as the Mashriq. The Berber tribes, who once held the position of the elite military units of the empire, operated in the Maghreb. These two mercenary armies did not get along, and the tension between them would soon cause the downfall of the Fatimid Empire. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the Fatimid Empire's most notorious caliph, Abu Ali al-Hakim. Succeeding his father al-Aziz at the age of only 11, al-Hakim was too young to rule the empire alone. For the first 4 years of his reign, the empire would be ruled by his vizier and court officials. However, al-Hakim didn't like the idea of others ruling his empire, so by the time he was 15 years old, he had his vizier and other members of the court executed. Al-Hakim would be remembered in history as the Mad Caliph, because his reign was one of absolute madness. This guy imposed crazy laws like banning music and dancing. He burned churches and persecuted religious minorities who were protected under the rule of his father. He even ordered the killing of all dogs in Cairo because he was annoyed by their barking. However, al-Hakim at least had the decency to just one day disappear into the deserts of Egypt without ever returning. Despite all his crazy shenanigans and horrible tyranny, al-Hakim would be revered as a central figure by the Druze religion, who to this day await his return. After the sudden disappearance of al-Hakim in 1021 CE, the Fatimid Empire began a long period of decline, starting out with a war between its Berber and Turkish armies. A series of riots, civil wars, and even an attempted coup drastically weakened the Fatimids throughout the 11th century. In 1048 CE, the Zirid Emirate that governed the western half of the empire declared independence from the Fatimids. The Zirid dynasty would continue to rule much of North Africa for the next 100 years as an economic powerhouse. The arrival of the Seljuk Turks revitalized the status of the Abbasids and brought more challenges for the Fatimids, taking their holdings in the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. The Fatimids would spend the remainder of their years competing with the Seljuks for dominance in the Levant. Not only would this constant fighting further divide the Islamic world, but it would also weaken the armies of the two empires, providing opportunity for foreign invaders. The competition between the Abbasids and Fatimids is perhaps the most memorable of all Islamic feuds, due to their different sects and rival capital cities. There is, however, one other competitor in this game of caliphs, one that is too often overlooked but should never be forgotten. After its revolution in 750 CE, the Abbasids inherited the empire that their Umayyad rivals had conquered and built. The Abbasids were quick to assassinate as many of the Umayyads as possible, tracking down and killing most of the dynasty's members. Abd al-Rahman I was one of the princes of the Umayyad royal family that managed to escape Abbasid persecution. He was the grandson of the Umayyad Caliph Hisham ibn al-Malik, and his mother was of Berber origin. The background of his mother would prove to be useful for Rahman, who escaped Syria into the Maghreb. There, he found himself embraced by many Berber tribes who liked the idea of one of their own being a member of Islamic royalty. In 755 CE, he crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, which at that point was being called Al-Andalus. He landed in the city of Malaga, where he was met with many supporters and an army. Al-Andalus was in a state of political division, with commanders and their armies dividing themselves on ethnic lines. Al-Rahman's royalty and lineage was an attractive asset for the Berber, Syrian, and Yemeni armies that have been fighting each other for power in the region. The governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Fahir, however, wasn't not happy to hear of Al-Rahman's arrival. He had been ruling the province of Al-Andalus independently from the Abbasids and did not want to share his power with Al-Rahman. Before he could confront Al-Rahman's forces in Malaga, Al-Fahir needed to take down a rebellion in Zaragoza. It was during Al-Fahir's campaign in northern Spain that Al-Rahman began his campaign in conquering the south. The two men with their armies met at the river of Guadalquivir, just outside of the city of Córdoba. Al-Rahman would emerge victorious. In 756 CE, Al-Rahman made Córdoba the capital city of his newly established emirate, and converted the city's Visigoth church into a mosque. In time, he would expand his rule to the cities of Toledo, Barcelona, Pamplona, and Zaragoza, becoming one of the most powerful states in Western Europe. In 929 CE, Abd al-Rahman III upgraded his title from emir to caliph, challenging the legitimacy of the Fatimids and their longtime rival, the Abbasids. Despite making enemies with the other Islamic powers, this transition from emirate to caliphate would usher in the beginning of an Iberian Golden Age of culture, literature, and science. After proclaiming himself as caliph, Abd al-Rahman III commissioned the construction of the Medina Azara, a palace city complex that really flexed the wealth and power of this new Islamic caliphate. During his rule, al-Rahman III also renovated the Mosque of Córdoba, adding a massive courtyard and its first official minaret. Being at the crossroads of Africa and Europe, Al-Andalus was a multicultural hub, being home to more Christians and Jews than Muslims. This diversity, however, was one of the main strengths of this caliphate's rule, as it provided hospitality and tolerance to other religious groups that would become the envy of not only Europe, but also the rest of the Islamic world. Al-Andalus became a cultural and intellectual center of the medieval world, hosting a royal library that contained hundreds of thousands of books and dozens of madrasas, of which students of all faiths and backgrounds studied in. This intellectual and religiously tolerant culture would even produce a golden age of Jewish learning and literature, all within the domain of the caliphate. Along with scientific advancements and philosophical works, the Caliphate of Al-Andalus also greatly impacted the development of Western music, introducing many instruments to Europe, such as the arable, the oud, and the rebab. This legacy of Andalusia's great cultural and material exchange would not only be an integral part to Spanish culture and identity, but would also serve as the main source of inspiration for the European Renaissance. But even with all its glamour and significance, the Umayyads of Córdoba would not last long. By 1031 CE, the Caliphate was seeing its central authority be pulled away by rival emirs, establishing autonomous principalities known as taifas. This period of division within the Caliphate provided opportunity for Christian kingdoms in the north to conquer some of the taifas. The king of Leon and Castile, Alfonso VI, managed to conquer the city of Toledo in 1085 CE, threatening Islamic rule in the peninsula. Divided among themselves, the emirs of the taifas could not defeat Alfonso's army alone. So the taifa emirs turned south towards Africa for reinforcements. In the Sahara Desert, an Islamic movement initiated by a Berber by the name of Abdullah ibn Yassin was becoming a major player in African politics. Starting out deep in the deserts of what is now Morocco, the Almoravids would find themselves controlling an empire that stretched from Gao in the south to Tangier in the north. They were an immensely powerful and wealthy empire, controlling much of the trade of gold, ivory, and slaves that flowed through the Sahara. In 1086 CE, the Almoravids were invited to Al-Andalus by the emirs, who needed their aid against Alfonso. Together, these allied forces would defeat Alfonso at the Battle of Sagrajas. After a successful first campaign, the Almoravids returned to their home in the Maghreb, but the incompetence of the Andalusian taifas was beginning to annoy the Almoravids, as they saw the emirs as impious and weak leaders. In 1090 CE, the Almoravids returned to Al-Andalus, this time overthrowing the emirs of the taifas, as well as expanding into Christian territory. The Berbers, or Moors as they were known to the Christians, came to Al-Andalus as soldiers, serving the Umayyad Caliphate and their emirs. Now, under the Almoravid dynasty, they ruled as the most powerful state in Europe. Under the rule of the Almoravids, Al-Andalus and the Maghreb continued to flourish as centers of culture, trade, and learning. But as the Almoravids continued being a big, strong, wealthy empire, the pious values that the movement once championed were no longer present in their practices. In the 1120 CE, a Berber man named Muhammad ibn Tumart initiated a religious movement in the Atlas Mountains that was to challenge the rule of the Almoravids. This movement called themselves Al-Muwahhidin, or the Almohads, those who believe in Tawheed, the oneness of God. In 1147 CE, the Almohads captured the city of Marrakesh under the leadership of Abd al-Mumin. After taking Marrakesh, al-Mumin would establish the city as the Almohad capital and proclaim himself as the legitimate caliph of the Islamic world. The following year, al-Mumin and his armies would take the remainder of the Almoravid holdings in what is now present-day Morocco, effectively ending their dynasty. After the defeat of the Almoravids, Al-Andalus experienced a second Taifa period, making the territory easy pickings for the newly established Almohad Empire. In 1150 CE, al-Mumin would begin a campaign throughout the North African coast, going as far east as Libya, making the Almohad Caliphate one of the most powerful dynasties on the Mediterranean. Despite having violently taken power from the Almoravids, the territory of the Almohads remained as prosperous as it did under its predecessors. The empire hosted many of Western Islam's greatest philosophers and scholars, like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Tufayl, who wrote on Islamic philosophy, language, medicine, and law. Like the Umayyads and Almoravids before, the Almohad Caliphate would continue to ride the wave of the Islamic Golden Age. In fact, even with all the rebellions, succession crises, and sectarian division, all three of these Islamic caliphates would continue to be the most advanced, powerful, and sophisticated political entities of their day. In their art, architecture, literature, science, and technology, Muslims flexed their influence and prestige to the rest of the medieval world. Whether in Baghdad, Bukhara, Cairo, Cordoba, or Marrakesh, the Islamic world represented the epitome of medieval civilization. But any successful civilization, no matter how civilized, builds their prosperity with the most savage of means. Next episode, we investigate the vast network and institution of Islamic slavery, revealing how its practice not only served as the backbone of Islamic civilization's economy and military, but also its downfall.